In 1996, humanity successfully cloned a mammal. Today, we can edit the human genome. We can print three-dimensional organs in sterile laboratories. We can grow synthetic beef from stem cells. We have, by all accounts, completely taken apart and reassembled the code of life. Humanity has conquered the physical world. But despite all of that technological power, the smartest scientists on Earth still cannot figure out how to breed one specific fish. By the end of this video, you will know exactly why science has surrendered to this animal, how that failure built a $3 billion criminal empire, and why the sushi on your plate may be the final stop in a massive international smuggling operation. This is the story of the Atlantic bluefin tuna, a fish that can swim over 40 miles per hour, live for more than 40 years, grow to over 1,500 pounds, and sell for more than $3 million as a single individual. A fish so valuable, so biologically stubborn, and so deeply embedded in global criminal networks that it has quietly become one of the most trafficked animals on the planet. And the reason none of that is your fault starts over 2,000 years ago, with a very famous philosopher who got it completely wrong. Aristotle was the man who laid the foundation for modern biology. He observed the natural world with a precision that no one had attempted before him. He categorized species. He studied anatomy. He was, in every sense, the first great scientist. And when he turned his attention to fish, he believed he could crack any mystery the ocean threw at him. He was right about almost everything, except the ones that mattered most. The bluefin tuna was not the only fish to confuse early science. For centuries, entire species seemed to appear and disappear without logical explanation. Populations would vanish from one body of water and materialize in another. Breeding seasons seemed to happen in places no human had ever observed. The ocean kept its deepest secrets locked behind depth, pressure, and darkness that early science simply could not penetrate. But the bluefin was different, because unlike a creature hiding in a cave or a species reproducing quietly in a marsh, the bluefin tuna lives its life almost entirely in the open ocean. And yet for a long time, no one could find where it spawned. No one could track its full life cycle, and no one could replicate it. Let us start with what makes this animal physically extraordinary, because you cannot understand why science cannot breed it until you understand what science is actually dealing with. The Atlantic bluefin tuna, known scientifically as Thunus thinus, is not a typical fish. It is built like a biological missile. Its body is a near-perfect hydrodynamic shape, capable of generating enough thrust to hit speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour. Its muscles generate so much internal heat that it is one of the few fish capable of regulating its own body temperature, making it warm-blooded in a way that almost no other fish on Earth can claim. It can dive to depths of over 3,000 feet. It can cross entire ocean basins. A single individual can weigh as much as a grand piano and live longer than most dogs, cats, and many humans ever will. It is also, gram for gram, one of the most commercially valuable animals ever caught by a human being. The Japanese concept of hanmaguro, which refers specifically to the Atlantic bluefin, sits at the absolute top of the sushi world. A single, high-grade fish sold at the famous Toyosu Market auction in Tokyo can fetch prices that make international headlines. In recent years, individual fish have sold for over $3 million at auction. The global bluefin tuna market as a whole, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is worth approximately $3 billion annually as of 2021. $3 billion every single year for one species of fish. Now consider this. You cannot farm it. You cannot breed it reliably. You cannot manufacture it. Every single one of those dollars is, in some way, extracted from a wild population that has already been pushed to the edge of collapse. Here's where the science gets brutal. Commercial fishing began targeting bluefin tuna in earnest in the early 1900s. Through the 1970s and 1980s, catches exploded. Industrial fleets with sonar technology, spotter planes, and purse-seine nets the size of football fields were pulling tens of thousands of tons of bluefin out of the Atlantic every year. The peak landings recorded in 2006 came in at 50,000 tons. That number sounds large. What it actually represented was the final stage of a catastrophic collapse that had been building for decades. By 2010, scientific assessments published by the International Union for Conservation of Nature confirmed what many researchers had feared for years. Atlantic bluefin tuna stocks had declined by 85% compared to historical population levels. 85%. That is not a dip. That is a near total erasure of a species from its natural range. The IUCN classified the Atlantic bluefin tuna as endangered. Let that sit for a moment. An animal generating $3 billion in annual trade. Classified as endangered. Still being caught. Still being auctioned. Still being flown across the world in refrigerated cargo holds and sliced in front of paying customers at Michelin-starred restaurants. The reason that contradiction exists is the same reason this video exists. Science tried to fix the problem by breeding bluefin in captivity, and science failed. The first successful captive breeding of bluefin tuna was achieved in 2002 by Kinki University in Japan. That sounds like a victory. It was not. Achieving one successful breeding event in a controlled research setting is a long way from building a commercial aquaculture system that can actually replace wild-caught populations at scale. And every attempt to scale that research into a real, functioning farm has run into the same walls. The bluefin's reproductive biology is extraordinarily complex. In the wild, these fish do not spawn in rivers or shallow coastal bays where humans can observe and intervene. They spawn in very specific deep-water locations in the open ocean. The Western Atlantic population spawns primarily in the Gulf of Mexico. The Eastern Atlantic population spawns primarily in the Mediterranean Sea. Getting them to those locations, under those conditions, at the right time of year, after years of ocean migration that conditions their hormonal cycles, is something no laboratory tank has ever come close to replicating at any useful scale. The larvae, once hatched, are almost impossibly fragile. They require specific water temperatures, specific light conditions, and highly specific feeding regimes involving microscopic prey that are themselves difficult and expensive to produce in captivity. Mortality rates in early larval development are devastating. Even under the most controlled research conditions, losses during the first weeks of life can wipe out entire cohorts. Then there is the sheer physical size problem. Adult bluefin that are ready to spawn are not small aquarium fish. They are animals that can exceed 1,500 pounds and need to travel at speed to stay healthy. Building a tank large enough, with water circulation powerful enough, to keep a breeding group of adult bluefin in the kind of physical condition required for successful reproduction is an engineering and financial challenge that has not been solved at commercial scale. As of 2023, advances in aquaculture techniques, including hybrid breeding experiments and artificial spawning methods, continue to be researched, but they remain limited. The fish has not been cracked. Science, for all of its power, is still chasing an animal that has been doing exactly what it wants for millions of years and has no intention of cooperating with a laboratory schedule. That failure created a vacuum, and the market does not wait for science to catch up. When a product is worth $3 billion a year, when demand from Tokyo to London to Los Angeles continues to grow, and when the only legal supply comes from tightly regulated wild catch quotas that get smaller every time a new stock assessment comes back with bad news, you get a crisis. And crises in commodity markets do not stay quiet for long. In 2011, CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, recommended stricter controls on bluefin tuna trade. International management plans with strict quotas were put in place by 2015. These measures were not nothing. As of 2023, there are signs that populations are slowly recovering, but they remain far below historical levels. And the quotas, while helping, have also done something the regulators did not intend. They made bluefin tuna even more valuable. When you restrict legal supply while demand stays constant, price goes up. When price goes up past a certain threshold, the economics of illegal fishing start to look very attractive to the kind of people who are already in the business of moving contraband across international borders. The same cartels and trafficking networks that move drugs, weapons, and counterfeit goods looked at the bluefin tuna market and saw a business opportunity. The math is grimly simple. A single large bluefin, caught illegally, outside of quota, costs nothing beyond the fuel and labor to catch it. Depending on its grade and weight, that same fish can sell for tens of thousands of dollars at the right wholesale contact in Japan or Hong Kong. If you can move even a handful of fish per trip and avoid detection, the returns rival anything the drug trade offers. But unlike cocaine, the penalties for wildlife trafficking in many jurisdictions are dramatically lower. The risk-to-reward calculation pushes organized crime directly into the fisheries sector. Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, which the industry calls IUU fishing, is a global problem across many species. But bluefin, because of its extreme per-unit value, attracts a particularly sophisticated level of criminal organization. This is not just a few rogue boats ignoring quotas. Full criminal networks operate with falsified documentation, corrupt port officials, shell companies registered across multiple countries, and financial infrastructure designed specifically to launder the proceeds from illegal catches. The laundering process itself reveals just how deeply this problem is embedded in the legal supply chain. A bluefin tuna caught illegally in the Atlantic, beyond any legal quota, cannot simply be dropped at a licensed fish market and sold. It needs paperwork. Every CITES-listed species requires documentation proving the fish was caught legally, within quota, by a licensed vessel. So criminal networks do what criminals always do when they need to move illegal goods through legal channels. They mix them in. Legal fishing operations with legitimate documentation catch their allowed quota. Then, outside of official records, the same or affiliated boats catch additional fish. Those extra fish get mixed into the same holds, processed at the same facilities, and exported with the same paperwork as the legal batch. By the time that fish reaches a restaurant in New York or a sushi counter in London, the documentation says everything is clean. The fish itself carries no label, telling you which individual was inside the legal quota and which one was not. Critics of current enforcement point out that compliance with international quota systems depends heavily on self-reporting by national fishing fleets and on the effectiveness of port-side inspections that vary wildly by country. In many major fishing nations, the infrastructure to meaningfully verify catch data simply does not exist at the level required. The paperwork trail that is supposed to prevent illegal fish from entering the market is, in practice, something that skilled criminal operations have learned to fabricate convincingly. This is not a fringe position. It is a documented pattern that has been flagged repeatedly by organizations tracking illegal wildlife trade, and it is backed by the basic economics of the situation. When one fish is worth tens of thousands of dollars, and the documentation system can be corrupted or forged, the incentive to do exactly that is enormous. The consumer at the end of this chain, the person ordering omakase at a high-end Japanese restaurant in Los Angeles, or picking up a bluefin sashimi platter in London, is not complicit in any conscious sense. The chef slicing the fish likely has no idea about the fish's specific origin beyond what the paperwork says. The restaurant owner bought from a licensed supplier with certified documentation. Every step of the visible chain looks legitimate. That is the point. That is what makes it work. But there is another layer to this story that goes beyond the criminal networks and the laundering operations. It goes back to the science. Because the failure to breed bluefin tuna in captivity is not just an economic inconvenience. It is a fundamental problem for the survival of the species itself. Unlike a domesticated animal, where captive populations can serve as a buffer if wild populations collapse, the bluefin has no such safety net. The captive breeding work at facilities like Kinki University in Japan produced a proof of concept. But a proof of concept achieved in 2002 has not translated into commercial-scale aquaculture that could meaningfully reduce pressure on wild stocks more than 2 decades later. The fish's complex life cycle requirements, its need for vast ocean spaces, its specific spawning locations, its fragile early larvae, all of these things combine to make it one of the hardest large fish species to bring into controlled production. The deep irony here is that the very characteristics that make the bluefin so physically extraordinary, its speed, its size, its ability to regulate body temperature and cross entire ocean basins, are the same characteristics that make it nearly impossible to contain and replicate in a farm setting. It is too wild, too large, too built for the open ocean. Science cannot shrink those requirements to fit inside a tank. And so the pressure on wild populations continues. Even as quota systems slowly work and populations show limited signs of recovery as of 2023, the underlying demand driving illegal fishing has not gone away. The $3 billion annual market has not shrunk. The cultural prestige of serving wild-caught Atlantic bluefin at a high-end restaurant has not diminished. The auctions in Tokyo, where single fish sell for millions of dollars, still make news every January, which is precisely what drives the next season of illegal fishing. Here is the data point that reframes everything. By 2010, Atlantic bluefin stocks had dropped 85% below historical levels. That means the fish generating $3 billion in annual trade was doing so from a population that was 1/7 of what it once was. The market was extracting maximum economic value from a collapsing biological base. That is not a sustainable system by any definition. That is a resource being liquidated. International management through bodies like the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, known as ICCKT, has attempted to pull the species back from the brink. The strict quotas introduced around 2015 and the CITES-backed trade controls implemented starting in 2011 have had measurable effects. The 2023 assessments suggesting some population recovery are real. But scientists and conservation groups are quick to point out that those numbers still represent a fraction of what the Atlantic bluefin population once looked like, and that illegal fishing continues to undercut even the modest gains that legal compliance has produced. The mainstream view in fisheries management is that the combination of quota enforcement, better monitoring technology, and continued investment in aquaculture research will eventually stabilize and rebuild the species. That view is supported by the recovery data coming out of the most recent stock assessments. The challenge to that consensus comes from researchers and enforcement specialists who argue that the quota system is fundamentally compromised by the scale of IUU fishing that goes undetected and uncounted. If a significant percentage of the actual catch each year never appears in official statistics because it moves through criminal networks with forged documentation, then the stock recovery models, which are built on reported catch data, are systematically underestimating the pressure on the population. You cannot manage a fishery accurately if the data feeding your management models has been corrupted by the very criminals profiting from the species' decline. That is not a theoretical concern. It is the documented reality of how illegal wildlife trade works. The organizations tracking it are not operating on speculation. The patterns of laundering, the falsified export certificates, the mixing of illegal catch with legal quota fish, these are established operational methods that enforcement agencies have confirmed repeatedly in prosecutions and seizures. The fish itself, living its long life in the open ocean, crossing from the Gulf of Mexico to the Mediterranean and back, diving 3,000 feet to chase prey, capable of living over 40 years and growing to a size that dwarfs almost any other bony fish on the planet, has no awareness of any of this. It is simply doing what it has done for millions of years. The crisis surrounding it is entirely a human production. The speed at which it can swim over 40 miles per hour makes it one of the most efficient predators in the open ocean. That same speed means that in the wild, a healthy bluefin can cover territory in a single day that would take a small vessel days to search. Tracking these animals, understanding their full migratory behavior, and intervening in their reproduction in ways that actually work under natural conditions, all of that requires technology and resources that even the most advanced research programs are still working to develop. The first time a bluefin was successfully bred in captivity was 2002. As of 2023, 21 years later, that breakthrough has not produced a commercial aquaculture sector capable of taking meaningful pressure off wild populations. 21 years is a long time in technology. The iPhone did not exist in 2002. The human genome had barely been sequenced. And yet the bluefin remains, in any practical sense, undomesticated. That gap between scientific achievement and commercial reality is where the criminal economy breathes and grows. Every year that aquaculture cannot deliver a reliable, scalable, legal supply is another year that illegal fishing networks can justify their operations on purely economic grounds. The demand exists. The legal supply is capped. The gap is profit. And profit in criminal networks is self-reinforcing. The water mules and the breathing suitcases described in glass eel smuggling operations are one expression of that principle. But the bluefin tuna trade operates at an even higher level of financial sophistication. The unit values are larger. The documentation requirements are more complex. The legal infrastructure that can be corrupted or mimicked is more elaborate. And the international scope of the operation, spanning fishing fleets in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, transit ports across multiple continents, auction houses in Japan, and restaurant supply chains reaching every major city in the developed world, requires a level of organizational complexity that puts it firmly in the category of serious transnational crime. When you order bluefin tuna at a restaurant, you are placing yourself at the end of that chain, not as a criminal, not as someone who can reasonably be expected to have traced the fish's journey from ocean to plate, but as the final node in a network that runs from an endangered population in the Atlantic, through illegal fishing operations, through laundering facilities, through falsified documentation, through licensed importers who genuinely may not know what they are receiving, to the knife of a chef who is simply working with what arrived that morning. The paperwork at every step says clean. The fish itself carries no confession. What does exist, and what researchers have increasingly turned to, is DNA-based traceability. Because while a customs agent cannot visually distinguish a legally caught Atlantic bluefin from an illegally caught one once the fish is processed, a genetic sample can tell you with precision which ocean it came from, which spawning population it belonged to, and in some cases, whether the documented catch origin matches the biological reality. DNA testing of seafood at point of sale has been used in research studies to demonstrate the scale of mislabeling and fraudulent documentation in the seafood industry broadly. It is one of the tools that enforcement agencies are beginning to use more systematically. It is also expensive, slow, and not yet standard practice in the supply chains of most restaurants or retail outlets. Which means that right now, in 2023, the gap between what the documentation says and what the biology actually shows is wide enough for billions of dollars of illegal product to move through it every year. The Atlantic bluefin tuna is, by any honest accounting, one of the most consequential animals on the planet right now. Not because of its beauty, though it is genuinely extraordinary. Not because of its ecological role, though it sits near the top of the open ocean food web, but because of the perfect storm of factors that surrounds it. Extreme market value, failed captive breeding, collapsed wild populations, inadequate enforcement, criminal networks sophisticated enough to exploit every gap in the system, and at the center of all of it, a biological mystery that the world's best aquaculture scientists have been trying to solve since 2002 with only limited success. An animal built for the open ocean, crossing basins, diving into the abyss, living for decades, that simply will not perform on demand inside a tank. That is nature's uncracked code. And as long as it remains uncracked, the shadow economy built around it will keep operating. The midnight fishing boats will keep running dark. The falsified export certificates will keep getting stamped. The illegal catch will keep getting mixed with the legal batch. And the final customer, chopsticks in hand, will keep eating a fish whose true story begins 3,000 miles away, beneath the surface of an ocean being quietly emptied by a market that has never learned how to stop taking. We like to believe that our supply chains are clean, that the systems we have built to regulate global trade are strong enough to keep the worst actors out. But the bluefin tuna tells a different story. It tells the story of what happens when an animal is worth too much to protect and too wild to replace. When the profit motive and the survival of a species are locked in direct conflict, and the science that was supposed to resolve that conflict has not yet found the answer. The fish generates $3 billion a year. It has declined 85% from its historical population. Science has been trying to breed it in captivity for over 2 decades with limited commercial success. And right now, somewhere in the Atlantic or Mediterranean, a boat that does not appear on any official registry is pulling one out of the water and planning exactly how to make it look legal before it reaches your plate. The glass eel is just one animal caught in this trap. If you want to understand how criminal networks are doing the same thing to another resource that builds the modern world itself, one that is even harder to track and even more deeply embedded in the global economy, click the next video. Right now, heavily armed operations in multiple countries are stealing something you would never think to protect, and the consequences are already showing up in the foundations of buildings you walk past every day. Click the video on your screen. The story continues.